The moment I saw Karen's smug face crumble as the bulldozer started clearing the lot next door, I knew every sleepless night planning my revenge had been worth it. She'd called my son's wheelchair ramp an eyesore that was ruining her property values, but now she was about to get a front-row seat to the most beautiful, inclusive space this neighborhood had ever seen. The local news crews were already setting up their cameras, and parents from 3 different school districts were arriving with their children to witness what would become known as the Miracle Garden. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the real story starts with a passive-aggressive letter that would change everything. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more epic Karen stories, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 3 months earlier, I was rushing to get my 8-year-old son Marcus ready for school when I noticed the envelope taped to our front door. No return address, just my name written in sharp, angular handwriting that somehow managed to look judgmental even on paper. Marcus was already strapped into his wheelchair, his backpack secured to the back of his chair, when I tore open the envelope and read the words that would ignite a fire inside me I didn't know existed. To the residents of 1247 Maple Drive, it began. While we understand that accommodations must be made for certain circumstances, the recent addition of the wheelchair ramp to your property has significantly altered the aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood. The concrete structure creates an industrial appearance that detracts from the carefully maintained residential character we've all worked so hard to preserve. Perhaps there might be alternative solutions that would be less visually intrusive while still meeting your family's needs. We hope you'll consider modifications that would be more in keeping with our community standards. A concerned neighbor. I read it twice, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Marcus had been born with spina bifida, and for the past 3 years since we'd moved into this house, he'd been struggling with the 2 steep steps leading to our front door. Some mornings I'd carry him up those steps when his energy was low, and other days he'd use his incredible upper body strength to pull himself up while I spotted him from behind. The ramp had been a necessity, not a choice, and it had taken us months to save the money for a contractor to install it properly. "Dad, are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through my anger. He had this way of reading my emotions that sometimes caught me off guard, an emotional intelligence that seemed far beyond his 8 years. "I'm fine, buddy," I said, folding the letter and shoving it into my pocket. "Just some neighborhood business. Are you ready for school?" As I pushed Marcus's wheelchair down the very ramp someone had called an eyesore, I couldn't help but notice how smoothly it operated, how the gentle slope made it easy for him to navigate independently when he'd wanted to. The contractor had done beautiful work, matching the gray concrete to our house's foundation and adding decorative elements that complemented our landscaping. It wasn't just functional, it was actually quite attractive. But someone in our neighborhood disagreed, and they'd felt entitled enough to leave an anonymous complaint on our door. That evening, after Marcus had finished his homework and was playing video games in his room, I found myself standing in our front yard, staring at the ramp and trying to see it through critical eyes. The structure was about 12 feet long, rising gradually from the sidewalk to our front door, with sturdy railings on both sides. Potted plants flanked the entrance, and solar lights illuminated the path at night. If anything, it had improved our home's curb appeal by making it more welcoming and accessible. I was lost in thought when I heard footsteps approaching from the house next door. My neighbor Janet, a retired teacher in her 70s, was walking her small terrier. "Evening, David," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that immediately put me at ease. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" "It is," I replied, then found myself asking, "Janet, can I ask you something? Does Marcus's ramp bother you? Does it look out of place?" She stopped walking and looked at me with genuine confusion. "Bother me? David, it's the most thoughtful addition to any home on this street. When my grandson broke his leg last summer, that ramp was a godsend. He could actually visit us without struggling with stairs." She paused, studying my expression. "Why do you ask?" I pulled the letter from my pocket and handed it to her. She read it under the streetlight, her expression growing more disgusted with each sentence. "This is despicable," she said finally. Whoever wrote this should be ashamed of themselves. That ramp represents love, care, and inclusion. It makes our neighborhood better, not worse. Do you have any idea who might have written it? I asked. Janet's expression darkened. I have suspicions, but I'd rather not speculate. However, I will say that some people seem to think they're the self-appointed guardians of neighborhood aesthetics. She handed the letter back to me. Don't let this get to you, David. Most of us are grateful to have you and Marcus as neighbors. Her words provided some comfort, but the letter continued to gnaw at me over the next few days. I found myself watching the neighbors more carefully, looking for signs of disapproval or judgment. Most people seemed genuinely friendly, waving as they passed by, some even stopping to chat with Marcus when he was playing in the front yard. But then I noticed her. Karen Morrison lived 3 houses down in a pristine colonial that looked like it had been plucked from a magazine cover. Every blade of grass was perfectly manicured, every flower bed precisely arranged, every surface power washed to an almost unnatural shine. She was probably in her mid-50s, with blonde hair that never seemed to move in the wind and clothing that looked like it came with care instructions written in 3 languages. I first noticed her reaction on a Tuesday morning when I was helping Marcus get into our car for school. She was checking her mailbox, but her eyes were fixed on us, and her expression was one of barely concealed disdain. When she noticed me looking back, she quickly averted her gaze and hurried back into her house. The pattern continued for several days. Karen would find excuses to be outside when Marcus and I were coming or going, always positioning herself with a clear view of our ramp, always with that same disapproving expression. She never spoke to us directly, but her body language was unmistakable. The confirmation came the following week during our monthly HOA meeting. I'd been attending these meetings sporadically since we'd moved to the neighborhood, mainly to stay informed about community issues and upcoming projects. The meetings were usually pretty mundane affairs, featuring discussions about landscaping contracts, snow removal policies, and the occasional complaint about barking dogs or holiday decorations. But this meeting was different. I walked into the community center to find an unusually large crowd. The normal attendance was maybe 15 people, but tonight there were at least 30 neighbors packed into the small room. I found a seat in the back, wondering what issue had drawn such a crowd. The HOA president, a mild-mannered accountant named Bill Stevens, called the meeting to order and began working through the usual agenda items. But I could sense an undercurrent of tension in the room, people shifting in their seats and whispering to each other. Finally, Bill reached the portion of the meeting reserved for new business and community concerns. That's when Karen Morrison stood up. "I'd like to address a matter that affects all of our property values," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be heard. "We have a situation in our neighborhood where a structure has been added to a property without proper HOA approval, and it's creating a precedent that could be problematic for all of us." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what she was talking about, but I remained silent, wanting to hear how she would present her case. "The structure in question is a concrete ramp that was added to 1247 Maple Drive," she continued. "While I understand the family's needs, the installation was done without consulting the Architectural Review Board, and the result is frankly an eyesore that detracts from our neighborhood's carefully maintained aesthetic standards." A murmur went through the room, and I felt dozens of eyes turning to look at me. My face burned with embarrassment and anger, but I forced myself to stay seated. "Furthermore," Karen continued, "this sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow one homeowner to make significant structural modifications without proper oversight, where does it end? What's to stop someone from adding a garage, a shed, or any other structure they deem necessary?" Bill Stevens looked uncomfortable, clearly unprepared for this level of controversy. "Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate your concerns, but I believe we should discuss this matter with the affected homeowner present. Is Mr. Thompson here tonight?" I stood up slowly, my legs feeling shaky. "I'm here." Karen turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw her expression up close. There was no sympathy, no acknowledgement of the difficulty of our situation, just cold disapproval and a sense of superiority. That made my blood boil. "Mr. Thompson," Bill said gently, Can you help us understand the situation with the ramp? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. My son Marcus has spina bifida and uses a wheelchair. The ramp is a medical necessity that allows him to access our home safely and independently. We had it professionally installed by a licensed contractor, and it meets all ADA requirements. That's all well and good, Karen interjected, but the fact remains that it was installed without HOA approval. Our CC clearly state that any exterior modifications must be approved by the Architectural Review Board. I felt my anger rising. With all due respect, Mrs. Morrison, we're talking about my son's ability to enter his own home. This isn't a decorative addition, it's a medical accommodation. And we're not unsympathetic to your situation, she replied, her tone suggesting the opposite. But rules exist for a reason. If you needed a ramp, you should have submitted plans to the board for approval. We might have been able to suggest alternatives that would have been less visually intrusive. Less visually intrusive? I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. Are you suggesting we should have built a ramp that doesn't work as well just to preserve your view? The room had gone completely silent, everyone watching this confrontation unfold. I could see some neighbors looking uncomfortable, others nodding in agreement with Karen, and a few watching me with expressions of sympathy. I'm suggesting, Karen said, her voice rising, that we all have a responsibility to maintain the standards that make this neighborhood desirable. Property values affect everyone, and what's good for one family isn't necessarily good for the community as a whole. That was the moment something inside me snapped, not into rage, but into cold, calculated determination. I looked at Karen Morrison. With her perfect hair and her perfect house, and her complete inability to see my son as anything more than an inconvenience to her property values, and I made a decision that would change everything. I understand your position, Mrs. Morrison, I said, my voice now eerily calm, and I appreciate everyone's input on this matter. The ramp stays, because it's a legal medical accommodation that my son needs. But I want you all to know that I hear your concerns about neighborhood aesthetics, and I'm committed to being a good neighbor. I sat back down, ignoring the continued murmurs and discussions around me. The meeting continued for another hour, with various committee reports and budget discussions, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was already working on something else entirely. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me with words of support. Janet patted my shoulder and told me I handled the situation with grace. A younger couple I'd never spoken to before introduced themselves and said they thought the ramp was a beautiful addition to the neighborhood. But I also noticed the small group that had clustered around Karen, speaking in hushed tones and glancing in my direction. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was outnumbered. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, I sat in my home office with my laptop open, researching property law and HOA regulations. I'd worked in real estate development for 15 years before switching to freelance consulting, and I still had contacts throughout the industry. More bien. Importantly, I understood how these systems worked, how properties were bought and sold, and how to navigate the complex web of zoning laws and municipal regulations. What I found during my research was interesting. Our HOA's CC did indeed require approval for exterior modifications, but they also contained specific language about reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ramp should have been approved automatically, and Karen's challenge was legally dubious at best. But that wasn't what captured my attention. While browsing the county assessor's website, I discovered something that made my heart race with possibility. The small vacant lot at 1249 Maple Drive, right next to Karen's perfectly manicured property, was listed as delinquent on property taxes. The lot had been owned by the HOA for years, apparently purchased with the intention of creating a small park or green space, but the project had never been completed. Now, after 3 years of unpaid taxes, it was scheduled for auction. I spent the rest of the night researching the property. It was a corner lot, about a quarter acre, with mature trees and a gentle slope that would be perfect for landscaping. More importantly, it was outside the HOA's jurisdiction for architectural review because it was currently HOA property. And once sold, it would be subject to city zoning laws rather than neighborhood covenants. By dawn, I had a plan. The next morning, I called my former colleague Rebecca Martinez, who worked in the city planning department. We collaborated on several projects over the years, and she knew the municipal approval process inside and out. "David, it's been too long," she said when I reached her. "What can I do for you?" "I need to understand the process for purchasing property in a tax auction," I said, "and I need to know about zoning regulations for a specific lot." I gave her the details of the property, and she promised to look into it and get back to me within the day. While I waited, I began sketching ideas for what I wanted to create on that lot. The vision that emerged was beautiful in its simplicity. A sensory garden designed specifically for children with disabilities, featuring raised beds for wheelchair access, textured pathways for different sensory experiences, and adaptive playground equipment that could accommodate children with various physical challenges. The centerpiece would be a small pavilion with built-in seating and a dedication plaque, but the most important element would be the name: the Marcus Thompson Memorial Sensory Garden. Not because Marcus was gone, but because I wanted his name permanently attached to something beautiful and inclusive in our neighborhood. I wanted every person who drove past Karen's house to see a sign bearing B, my son's name, and know that this was a place where all children were welcome. Rebecca called back that afternoon with good news. The lot was indeed scheduled for auction in 6 weeks, and the minimum bid was only $12,000 to cover the back taxes and fees. Even better, the zoning allowed for public recreational use, which meant my sensory garden plan would be completely legal. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said. "If you're serious about this, I'd recommend getting pre-approved for financing and having all your permits ready to go. Projects like this can face challenges from neighbors who oppose them, so you want to be bulletproof from a legal standpoint." "What kind of challenges?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Noise complaints, traffic concerns, environmental impact studies, you name it. People who don't want something in their neighborhood can be very creative about finding reasons to oppose it." "And what's the best way to protect against that?" "Community support," she said without hesitation. "If you can demonstrate that the project has backing from local residents, schools, and advocacy groups, it becomes much harder to oppose. Public opinion matters more than people realize." That evening, I sat Marcus down for a serious conversation. He was in his room, working on a model airplane, his small hands carefully gluing together tiny pieces with the patience and precision that never ceased to amaze. "May. Marcus, I want to talk to you about something important," I said, settling into the chair beside his desk. He looked up from his model, his dark eyes curious. "Am I in trouble?" "No, buddy, you're not in trouble. But I want to tell you about something that happened at the HOA meeting, and I want to ask for your help with the project." I explained the situation as gently as possible, focusing on the fact that some neighbors had concerns about our ramp. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. "They think our ramp is ugly?" he asked when I finished. "Some people do," I said, "but a lot of our neighbors think it's great. Mrs. Janet told me it helped her grandson when he broke his leg." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Dad, are you sad about what they said?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on my anger and my plans for revenge that I hadn't really processed the emotional impact of Karen's words. But looking at my son's concerned face, I realized that yes, I was sad. Sad that anyone would see his medical needs as an inconvenience. Sad that he would have to grow up in a world where his accessibility was viewed as a burden. "A little," I admitted, "but mostly I'm determined to make things better." "What do you mean?" I told him about my plan for the sensory garden, about the lot next to Karen's house, about creating a space where all children could play together. His eyes lit up with excitement as I described the adaptive playground equipment and the raised garden beds. "And you want to name it after me?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Only if you're okay with that," I said. "It would be a way to show everyone that children with disabilities deserve beautiful, accessible spaces too." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then he asked, "Will other kids like me be able to play there?" "That's the whole point," I said. "It'll be designed so that kids with wheelchairs, kids with visual impairments, kids with autism, and kids without any disabilities can all play together. Can I help design it?" he asked. "I was hoping you'd ask," I said, pulling out my sketches. "I need an expert consultant, and you're the smartest person I know when it comes to what works and what doesn't." Over the next few weeks, Marcus and I worked together every evening, refining the design for the sensory garden. He had insights I never would have considered, pointing out that certain types of swings would be difficult for children with limited mobility to transfer into, suggesting that pathways should have rest areas for children who tired easily, and recommending specific plants that would provide interesting textures and scents without being overwhelming for children with sensory sensitivities. Meanwhile, I was busy with the practical aspects of the project. I attended the tax auction and successfully bid on the lot for $14,000, only $2,000 over the minimum bid. I hired a surveyor to confirm the exact boundaries and an environmental consultant to ensure there were no soil contamination issues. I met with landscape architects, playground equipment manufacturers, and accessibility consultants. But most importantly, I began building community support. I started by reaching out to the parents of Marcus's classmates. His school had a strong inclusive education program, and many of the families had children with various disabilities. When I explained the project, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents offered to volunteer their time, local businesses offered to donate materials, and several families pledged financial support. Next, I contacted local disability advocacy groups. The regional chapter of the United Spinal Association was immediately interested, as was the local Autism Support Network and the Association for the Blind. Each organization offered to help with design input, fundraising, and volunteer coordination. The breakthrough came when I reached out to Channel 7 News. Their investigative reporter, Maria Santos, had done several pieces on accessibility issues in our city, and she was intrigued by the story of a father creating an inclusive space in response to discrimination. "Tell me more about this neighbor who complained about your son's ramp," she said during our phone conversation. I gave her the details, being careful to stick to the facts rather than my emotional reactions. Maria listened intently, asking follow-up questions about the HOA meeting and Karen's specific comments. "This is exactly the kind of story we need to be telling," she said. "Would you be willing to do an on-camera interview, and would your son be comfortable being interviewed as well?" I discussed it with Marcus, who was excited about the possibility of being on television. We scheduled the interview for the following week. The day of the interview, Maria and her camera crew arrived at our house in the early afternoon. She was a petite woman with short dark hair and an immediately warm demeanor that put both Marcus and me at ease. "Before we start filming," she said, "I want you to know that I've done some research on your neighbors' complaints. I've reviewed the HOA meeting minutes and spoken with several other residents. The story that's emerging is about much more than just a ramp." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that this appears to be part of a pattern of exclusionary behavior in your neighborhood. Your neighbor has filed complaints about children playing in the street, about holiday decorations that don't meet her standards, and about visitors parking on the street. Several residents I spoke with described her as someone who views the neighborhood as her personal domain." The interview itself went better than I'd expected. Maria asked thoughtful questions about Marcus's experiences with accessibility, about the challenges of raising a child with disabilities, and about the importance of inclusive community spaces. Marcus was articulate and charming, explaining how the ramp had changed his life and sharing his excitement about the Sensory Garden project. "What do you hope other children will experience in this garden?" Maria asked him. "I hope they'll have fun," Marcus said simply. "And I hope kids like me, and kids who aren't like me, can play together and be friends." The segment aired 3 days later during the evening news. It was a 5-minute piece that perfectly captured the essence of the story, a father and son working to create something beautiful and inclusive in response to discrimination. The piece included interviews with several neighbors who supported the project, footage of Marcus navigating his ramp with a big smile, and artist renderings of the proposed sensory garden. But the most powerful moment came when Maria confronted Karen Morrison outside her house. "Mrs. Morrison," Maria said, "several neighbors have told us that you've been vocal in your opposition to accommodations for disabled residents. Can you comment on that?" Karen's response was everything I could have hoped for. Instead of showing compassion or acknowledging the impact of her words, she doubled down on her position. "I have nothing against disabled people," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "But property values matter, and when someone makes modifications that affect the entire neighborhood, there should be a process for review and approval, even when those modifications are medical necessities?" Maria pressed. "There are always alternatives," Karen replied. "More discreet alternatives that don't impact the aesthetics of the community." The interview made Karen look exactly like what she was, a privileged, narrow-minded person who valued her property values over a child's accessibility needs. But more importantly, it galvanized public support for the Sensory Garden project. The day after the news segment aired, my phone didn't stop ringing. Parents, teachers, therapists, and advocates called to offer support. A local landscaping company offered to donate plants and labor. A playground equipment manufacturer offered to provide adaptive equipment at cost. 3 different contractors volunteered to help with construction. Most gratifying of all, the story had gone viral on social media. #MarcusGarden was trending locally, and hundreds of people were sharing the story with messages of support. The project had evolved from a personal response to discrimination into a community-wide movement for inclusion. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the news segment aired, I received a call from the city's Parks and Recreation Department. The director, a woman named Linda Chen, wanted to discuss the Sensory Garden project. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I've been following the story about your project, and I'm impressed by what you're trying to accomplish. I'd like to discuss the possibility of the city partnering with you on this initiative." "What kind of partnership?" I asked. "We've been looking for ways to improve accessibility in our parks and recreational facilities," she explained. "Your Sensory Garden could serve as a model for future projects throughout the city. We'd like to provide technical support, help with permits and approvals, and potentially contribute funding for ongoing maintenance." The offer was more than I dared to hope for. City partnership would provide legitimacy and long-term sustainability for the project. It would also make it much harder for Karen or other neighbors to oppose the garden through legal challenges. "There's one condition," Linda continued. "We'd want to ensure that the garden is truly public and accessible to all residents, not just those in your immediate neighborhood." "That's exactly what we want," I said. "The whole point is to create a space where all children can play together." Construction began in early spring, just as the weather was warming up enough for outdoor work. The transformation was remarkable to watch. The empty lot that had been nothing but overgrown grass and weeds was gradually converted into a beautiful, functional space that exceeded even my ambitious plans. The landscape architect had designed winding pathways that were smooth enough for wheelchairs, but textured enough to provide sensory input for children with visual impairments. Raised garden beds were positioned at various heights to accommodate different abilities, and the adaptive playground equipment was unlike anything I'd seen before. There was a wheelchair-accessible treehouse with a ramp that spiraled gently upward, a sensory play wall with different textures and sounds, and a large sandbox with built-in transfer stations for children who needed help getting in and out of their wheelchairs. The centerpiece was a beautiful pavilion with built-in seating and a dedication plaque that read, "The Marcus Thompson Memorial Sensory Garden, a place where all children belong." Marcus was involved in every aspect of the construction, serving as our official accessibility consultant. The contractors loved having him on site, asking his opinion about pathway slopes, equipment placement, and sight lines. He took his role seriously, testing every element of the playground and suggesting modifications to make it work better for children with different abilities. The garden's impact on the neighborhood was immediate and profound. Even during construction, families would walk by to check on the progress, and children would press their faces against the temporary fencing to get a better look at the emerging playground. The local elementary school planned field trips to the garden, and several therapy practices expressed interest in using it for treatment sessions. But the most satisfying part was watching Karen Morrison's reaction to the transformation happening right next to her property. At first, she tried to ignore it. She'd installed privacy screens along her fence line and avoided looking in the direction of the construction site. But as the garden took shape and the community excitement grew, Her discomfort became increasingly obvious. I would sometimes see her standing at her upstairs window, watching the construction with an expression of barely contained fury. She'd tried to file complaints with the city about noise, dust, and parking issues, but each complaint had been dismissed because we were following all proper procedures and regulations. The breaking point came when the local news returned to do a follow-up story on the garden's progress. This time, they wanted to interview neighbors about their reactions to the project. Most of the responses were overwhelmingly positive, with parents expressing excitement about having such a wonderful resource in their neighborhood. But when Maria Santos approached Karen for comment, her response was even more damaging than her first interview. "This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand," Karen said, her voice tight with anger. "What started as a simple request for aesthetic compliance has turned into a circus. We have news crews, construction vehicles, and crowds of people trampling through our neighborhood every day. This isn't what any of us signed up for when we bought homes here." "But don't you think it's wonderful that children with disabilities will have a place to play?" Maria asked. "Of course I think it's wonderful," Karen replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But there are appropriate places for these kinds of facilities: parks, schools, community centers, not in the middle of a residential neighborhood where it's going to create traffic and noise problems." "The garden is designed to be a quiet, peaceful space," Maria pointed out. "And it's fully compliant with all city regulations." "Regulations can be changed," Karen said ominously. "And if this project creates the problems I expect it to, you can be sure that some of us will be working to prevent similar situations in the future." The interview painted Karen as not just unsympathetic, but actively hostile to the idea of inclusive community spaces. The backlash was swift and severe. #KarenVs.Kids began trending on social media, with hundreds of people sharing their own stories of discrimination and exclusion. But more importantly, the interview galvanized even more support for the sensory garden. Donations poured in from across the region, allowing us to add features we'd never dreamed possible. A local artist created a beautiful mural on the pavilion wall depicting children of all abilities playing together. A technology company donated interactive educational displays that taught visitors about different types of disabilities and the importance of inclusion. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in late spring, and the response exceeded our wildest expectations. Over 500 people attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, including the mayor, several city council members, and representatives from disability advocacy organizations throughout the region. Marcus was given the honor of cutting the ribbon, a moment that brought tears to my eyes as I watched him maneuver his wheelchair up to the ceremonial tape and carefully snip it with oversized scissors. The crowd erupted in cheers, and I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with love. The first children to enter the garden were a diverse group that perfectly represented our vision: kids in wheelchairs, kids with visual impairments, kids with autism, and kids without disabilities, all running, rolling, and exploring together. They immediately gravitated toward different elements of the playground, some heading for the adaptive swings, others investigating the sensory play wall, and still others climbing up the ramp to the treehouse. But the moment that will stay with me forever was when Marcus met Sarah, a 6-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who used a walker. I watched as they figured out how to navigate the playground together, Marcus showing her the best pathways and Sarah pointing out interesting textures and sounds she discovered along the way. Within minutes, they were fast friends, planning adventures and sharing the kind of unself-conscious joy that only children can experience. The media coverage was extensive and overwhelmingly positive. The story was picked up by national news outlets, and the Marcus Thompson Memorial Sensory Garden became a symbol of community inclusion and the power of turning discrimination into positive action. But the real measure of success wasn't the media attention or the awards the garden would eventually receive. It was the daily stream of families who came to play, the therapy sessions conducted in the peaceful pavilion, and the birthday parties held in a space where every child could participate fully. 6 months after the grand opening, I was sitting in the pavilion, watching Marcus play with a group of friends from school. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn, and the garden had evolved into an even more beautiful space as the plants matured and the community made it their own. That's when I noticed Karen Morrison standing at the edge of the property, watching the children play. She'd been largely invisible since the grand opening, keeping to herself and avoiding any interactions with the families who used the garden. But now she was there, her expression unreadable as she observed the scene. I walked over to where she was standing, curious about what had drawn her out of her self-imposed isolation. "It's a beautiful day," I said simply. She turned to look at me, and I was surprised by what I saw in her eyes. Not anger or resentment, but something that looked almost like regret. "It's not what I expected," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" "The garden," she said, gesturing toward the playground where children were laughing and playing. "I expected it to be chaotic, noisy, disruptive, but it's actually quite peaceful." I nodded, unsure how to respond. This was the first real conversation we'd had since the confrontation at the HOA meeting, and I wasn't sure where it was heading. "I've been watching the children," she continued. "The way they help each other, the way they play together despite their differences. I never really understood what you were trying to create. And now you do?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching as Marcus and Sarah worked together to build something in the sandbox. "I'm not sure I understand it completely," she said finally. "But I can see that it's something good, something important." It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a complete transformation of her worldview. But it was acknowledgement, and perhaps the beginning of understanding. I realized that the sensory garden had accomplished something I'd never intended. It had created a space where empathy could grow, where differences could be celebrated rather than feared, and where the true meaning of community could be discovered. "You're welcome to visit any time," I said. "There's always room for more community members." She nodded, then turned and walked back toward her house. I watched her go, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The anger and desire for revenge that had driven me to create the garden had long since been replaced by something deeper and more meaningful, a sense of purpose and pride in what we built together. The Marcus Thompson Memorial Sensory Garden had become more than just a response to discrimination. It had become a testament to the power of inclusion, the importance of accessibility, and the beautiful things that can happen when a community comes together to support all of its members. As I watched my son playing with his friends in the space that bore his name, I realized that the real victory wasn't in proving Karen wrong or in getting revenge for her hurtful words. The real victory was in the laughter of children who might otherwise have had nowhere to play, in the friendships that were forming across lines of difference, and in the knowledge that Marcus would grow up in a world where his worth was measured not by his disability, but by his contributions to the community around him. The garden had taught me that the best response to exclusion isn't anger or revenge, but the creation of spaces where everyone belongs. And in building that space, we built something far more valuable than any personal victory. We built a better world for all of our children. As the seasons changed, and the garden established itself as a cornerstone of our community, unexpected developments began to unfold that would test everything we built and reveal truths I never could have anticipated. The first sign that our story was far from over came on a crisp October morning when I received a certified letter from the law offices of Brennan, Mitchell Associates. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, fearing that Karen had found some legal avenue to challenge the garden's existence. Instead, I found something completely unexpected. The letter was from Karen's attorney, but it wasn't a lawsuit or a complaint. It was a request for a meeting to discuss what the lawyer termed a matter of mutual interest regarding community development and Mrs. Morrison's desire to make amends for past misunderstandings. I read the letter 3 times, trying to decode the legal language and figure out what Karen could possibly want to discuss. The phrase, "make amends," particularly caught my attention, as it suggested a level of contrition I'd never expected from her. Marcus was at school when I called the attorney's office to schedule the meeting. The receptionist was pleasant but vague about the purpose of the meeting, explaining only that Mrs. Morrison had requested my presence to discuss a proposal that could benefit the entire community. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at 2 o'clock, which gave me a week to speculate about Karen's motives. During that time, I found myself observing her more carefully, looking for clues about what she might be planning. What I noticed surprised me. Karen had begun taking daily walks that happened to coincide with the garden's busiest hours. She would stroll past the playground, sometimes stopping to watch the children play from a distance. On several occasions, I saw her speaking with other neighbors near the garden's entrance, engaged in what appeared to be friendly conversations. Even more intriguing was the change in her property's appearance. The rigid perfection that had once characterized her landscaping was giving way to something softer and more natural. She'd added a small flower garden near her front walkway, planted with varieties that seemed chosen more for their sensory appeal than their visual impact. Lavender, mint, and other fragrant herbs now grew where perfectly manicured grass had once dominated. The attorney's office was located in a sleek downtown building that seemed designed to intimidate clients and opposing parties. I arrived 15 minutes early, using the time to review my notes about the garden's legal status and funding sources. I wanted to be prepared for whatever Karen might propose. Karen arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Robert Brennan. She looked different than I'd ever seen her, less polished and more approachable. Her usual armor of perfectly styled hair and designer clothing had been replaced by a simple sweater and slacks that made her seem more human. "Thank you for coming, David," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I know this must seem strange, given our history." "I'm certainly curious," I replied, settling into the conference room chair across from her. Robert Brennan opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. "Mrs. Morrison has asked me to help her with a rather unusual project," he began. "She's expressed interest in making a significant contribution to your community garden, but she wants to ensure that the contribution is structured in a way that serves the community's long-term interests." I felt my eyebrows rise in surprise. "What kind of contribution?" Karen leaned forward, her expression earnest. "David, I want to establish a foundation that will provide ongoing funding for the garden's maintenance and expansion. I'm prepared to contribute $200,000 as an initial endowment, with the understanding that the foundation will be managed by a board that includes you, representatives from the disability advocacy community, and other neighborhood stakeholders." End quote. The number hit me like a physical blow. $200,000 would transform the garden from a community project into a permanent institution, ensuring its sustainability for decades to come. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you want to do this?" Karen was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability I'd never heard from her before. "Do you remember when I said I'd been watching the children in the garden?" she asked. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I'd been going there every day, not just to watch, but to try to understand what I'd been fighting against. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. 3 weeks ago, I met a little girl named Emma who has Down syndrome. She was playing alone in the sandbox while her mother talked with other parents. I watched her for a while, and something about her isolation reminded me of myself as a child. I remained silent, sensing that she needed to tell this story without interruption. "I grew up in a family that valued perfection above everything else," she continued. "My parents had very specific ideas about what was acceptable and what wasn't. I learned early that love was conditional, that it had to be earned through achievement and compliance with their standards." Her voice grew softer. "I had a younger brother, Danny, who was born with what we now know was autism, but in the 1970s, there wasn't much understanding or support for children like him. My parents were ashamed of his differences, and they made it clear that our family's reputation depended on hiding his condition from the outside world." I felt a chill of recognition. The rigid perfectionism that had characterized Karen's approach to the neighborhood suddenly made sense in a way I'd never considered. "Danny never got the support he needed," she continued. "He was isolated, hidden away, made to feel like a burden rather than a beloved family member. By the time he was a teenager, he'd withdrawn completely. He died by suicide when he was 17. The conference room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I found myself struggling to process this revelation, to reconcile the Karen I'd known with the grieving sister who sat across from me. "I'm so sorry," I said finally. "I had no idea," Of course you didn't, she replied. I've spent my entire adult life trying to maintain the kind of perfect environment my parents demanded. I thought that if I could control everything around me, I could prevent the kind of tragedy that destroyed my family. She looked directly at me for the first time since she'd begun her story. When I saw your son's ramp, it triggered something in me. It represented everything I'd been taught to fear and hide, but watching the children in the garden, seeing how they accept and support each other, I realized that I'd been wrong about everything. Robert Brennan cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Morrison came to me because she wants to ensure that her contribution is legally structured to prevent any future challenges to the garden's existence. The foundation would be independent of both the HOA and the city, with its own board of directors and clear bylaws protecting the garden's inclusive mission. There's one condition, Karen said. I'd like to add a small memorial section to the garden, dedicated to children with disabilities who didn't receive the support they needed. I want Danny's name to be included, along with others who were lost to ignorance and prejudice. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I considered the magnitude of what she was offering. Not just the financial contribution, but the courage to honor her brother's memory in such a public way. I think that would be beautiful, I said. But I have to ask, why now? What changed? Karen smiled for the first time since I'd known her, and it transformed her entire face. Emma, the little girl I mentioned? She came over to me that day in the sandbox and asked if I wanted to help her build a castle. No one had ever asked me to play before, not even as a child. And as we built that castle together, I realized that everything I'd been fighting against was actually everything I'd been missing. The meeting continued for another hour as we discussed the legal details of the foundation and the process for selecting board members. Robert Brennan had already drafted articles of incorporation and bylaws that would protect the garden's mission while allowing for future expansion and development. But the most significant moment came when Karen asked if she could visit the garden with me the following week to discuss the memorial section's design. I'd like Marcus to be involved in the planning, she said. He understands this community better than anyone, and I think Danny would have liked him very much. That weekend, I sat down with Marcus to tell him about Karen's proposal. He listened intently as I explained about the foundation and the memorial section, his expression growing more serious as I shared what I could of Karen's family history. Is she sad about her brother? He asked when I finished. Very sad, I confirmed. She's carried that sadness for a very long time. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you think the memorial will help her feel better? I think it might, I said. Sometimes when we honor the people we've lost, it helps us heal from the pain of losing them. Then we should help her make it really special, Marcus said with the matter-of-fact compassion that never ceased to amaze me. The following Tuesday, Karen arrived at the garden just as the afternoon rush was beginning. Children were streaming in from nearby schools, their voices filling the air with excitement and laughter. I watched her face as she took in the scene, noting how her expression had changed from the disapproval I'd once seen to something approaching wonder. Marcus wheeled over to greet her, his natural friendliness immediately putting her at ease. Hi, Mrs. Morrison, he said. Dad told me about your brother. I'm sorry he was sad. Karen's eyes filled with tears, but she managed to smile. Thank you, Marcus. I think he would have been happy to see this place. Together, we walked through the garden as Marcus gave Karen a comprehensive tour, explaining the function of each element and sharing stories about the children who used them. She asked thoughtful questions about accessibility features and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how the space worked for children with different abilities. Where do you think the memorial should go? She asked when we'd completed the circuit. Marcus considered the question seriously, his gaze sweeping across the garden. Maybe over there, he said, pointing to a quiet corner. Near the pavilion. It's peaceful, but people can still see it when they're playing. What should it look like? Karen asked. I think it should have a bench where people can sit and remember, Marcus said. And maybe some flowers that smell good. Dad says memories are stronger when they have smells with them. Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. Danny loved flowers, she said softly. He used to collect them from our yard and press them between the pages of books. My mother would get so angry because he was ruining her garden, but he said the flowers were happier in the books where they could be beautiful forever. Over the following weeks, Karen became a regular presence at the garden. She would arrive each afternoon with sketches and ideas for the memorial section, working with Marcus and me to design something that would honor her brother while fitting seamlessly into the garden's existing aesthetic. The memorial that emerged from our collaboration was breathtaking in its simplicity and power. A curved stone bench inscribed with the words, "In memory of children whose light was dimmed too soon," sat surrounded by a sensory garden filled with fragrant herbs and flowers. Wind chimes created gentle music, and a small water feature provided the soothing sound of flowing water. But the most powerful element was a series of engraved stones embedded in the pathway, each bearing the name of a child who had been lost to ignorance, prejudice, or lack of support. Danny's name was there, along with others contributed by families throughout the region who had experienced similar tragedies. The memorial's dedication ceremony was held on a gray November afternoon, attended by hundreds of people who came to honor the children who had been lost and to celebrate the progress that had been made. Karen spoke about her brother with a courage that left few eyes dry in the audience. Danny never got to experience the kind of acceptance and inclusion that this garden represents, she said, her voice strong despite her tears. But by creating this space, by choosing inclusion over exclusion, we ensure that his memory becomes part of something beautiful and lasting. The ceremony concluded with the planting of a memorial tree, a flowering cherry that would bloom each spring as a symbol of renewal and hope. Karen and Marcus worked together to place the sapling in the ground, their hands covered in earth as they performed this act of remembrance and commitment. As winter settled over the garden, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. What had begun as a response to discrimination had evolved into something far more profound, a space where healing could occur, where understanding could grow, and where the full spectrum of human experience could be celebrated. The foundation that Karen had established was already making a difference. The initial endowment had been supplemented by additional donations from Mine throughout the region, and the board of directors was planning expansions that would make the garden even more accessible and inclusive. But perhaps the most significant change was in Karen Das herself. The rigid perfectionism that had once defined her had given way to something more flexible and compassionate. She had become one of the garden's most dedicated volunteers, arriving early each morning to tend to the memorial section and staying late to help with evening programs. One snowy December evening, as I was locking up the garden after a holiday celebration, I found Karen sitting on the memorial bench despite the cold. She was wearing a simple wool coat and had a thermos of what smelled like hot chocolate beside her. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned about her sitting outside in the cold. "I'm more than okay," she said, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I'm grateful." I sat down beside her on the bench, and we looked out at the garden covered in fresh snow. The playground equipment stood like sculptures in the white landscape, and the pavilion glowed with warm light from the solar fixtures Karen had donated. "Danny would have loved this place," she said softly. "He would have loved the way the children play together, the way they help each other, the way they see past differences to find connection." "He would have loved you too," I said, "the person you've become." She turned to look at me, and I was struck by how much she had changed over the past year. The sharp edges had been smoothed away, replaced by something warmer and more genuine. "I spent so many years trying to create perfection," she said. "But perfection isn't about excluding what's different or challenging. It's about creating space where everyone can flourish." As we sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall on the garden that had brought us together, I realized that the story I'd thought was about revenge had actually been about redemption. Not just Karen's redemption, but my own as well. The anger that had driven me to create the garden had been transformed into something more powerful. The understanding that our differences are not obstacles to overcome but gifts to celebrate. The memorial section had become a place where grief could be honored and transformed into hope, where the lessons of the past could inform the possibilities of the future. Spring arrived early that year, And with it came new developments that would test our community's commitment to inclusion in ways we hadn't anticipated. The garden's success had attracted attention from urban planners and accessibility advocates across the country, and we began receiving requests from other communities wanting to replicate our model. But success also brought challenges. The increased visibility meant more visitors, more programs, and more complexity in managing the garden's operations. The foundation board was meeting weekly to address issues ranging from parking and crowd control to educational programming and volunteer coordination. The most significant challenge came from an unexpected source: the city's Parks and Recreation Department. Linda Chen, who had been so supportive of the original project, called me with disturbing news. "David, I need to let you know that the City Council is considering a proposal to incorporate the Marcus Thompson Memorial Sensory Garden into the municipal park system," she said during our phone conversation. On the surface, it sounds like a good thing, but there are some aspects of the proposal that concern me. "What kind of aspects?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling about where this was heading. "The proposal includes provisions for standardizing the garden's design and programming to align with other city facilities," she explained. "They're talking about removing elements that don't meet standard playground safety requirements and implementing programming that follows the department's established protocols." I felt a familiar surge of protective anger. "Are they talking about removing the adaptive equipment?" "Some of it," Linda confirmed. "The city's insurance company has raised concerns about liability issues with some of the more specialized equipment. They're recommending that it be replaced with standard playground equipment that meets conventional BAL safety standards." "But that would defeat the entire purpose of the garden," I protested. "The adaptive equipment is what makes it accessible to children with different abilities." "I know," Linda said, her voice heavy with regret. "That's why I'm calling you. I wanted you to know about this before it becomes public, so you can prepare a response." I spent the next hour pacing around my house, trying to process this new threat to everything we'd built. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very success that had made the garden a model for other communities was now threatening its unique character. Marcus was at school, but I knew I needed to discuss this with him before taking any action. He had become not just the garden's namesake, but its most effective advocate, and his perspective would be crucial in determining how to respond. That evening, I sat down with Marcus to explain the situation. He listened with the same serious attention he'd shown when we'd first discussed Karen's complaints about the ramp. "Would they really take away the treehouse ramp?" he asked when I finished. "They might," I said. "The city is worried about safety and liability issues." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then asked, "But don't they understand that the ramp is what makes the treehouse safe for kids like me?" "I think they understand that," I said. "But they're more worried about following rules than about what actually works for the children who use the garden." "That's not fair," Marcus said with the righteous indignation that only children can muster. "We worked really hard to make the garden perfect for everyone." "Yes, we did," I agreed. "And now we need to work just as hard to protect it." I called an emergency meeting of the foundation board for the following evening. The conference room at Robert Brennan's office was packed with board members, volunteers, and parent advocates, all united in their determination to protect the garden's unique character. Karen was among the first to arrive, and I was struck by how naturally she had assumed a leadership role in the garden's advocacy efforts. The transformation from opponent to champion had been so complete that new volunteers sometimes had trouble believing she had ever been anything other than supportive. "I've been researching the legal issues," she announced as the meeting began. "The city's proposal would require the foundation to surrender ownership of the garden to the Parks and Recreation Department, but our articles of incorporation include specific protections against that kind of takeover." Robert Brennan nodded in agreement. "The foundation was structured specifically to maintain independence from municipal control," he confirmed. "The city can't force us to transfer ownership, but they could make it difficult for us to operate by changing zoning requirements or imposing new regulations." "So, what are our options?" asked Maria Santos, the investigative reporter who had covered our story from the beginning and had joined the board as a community representative. "We fight," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a developmental pediatrician who had become one of the garden's most vocal advocates. We demonstrate that the garden's current design and programming are not only safe but superior to conventional playground facilities for children with disabilities. And we mobilize public support, added Ian. Karen. The garden has advocates throughout the region. If we can show the city council that the community opposes these changes, they'll have to reconsider. Over the next 2 weeks, our volunteer network launched a campaign that rivaled a political election in its intensity and organization. Parents, teachers, therapists, and advocates flooded the city council with letters, emails, and phone calls supporting the garden's current design and programming. The medical community rallied behind us as well. Dr. Walsh organized a coalition of pediatricians, occupational therapists, and other healthcare professionals who provided detailed explanations of why the garden's adaptive equipment was not only safe, but medically necessary for many children. But the most powerful advocacy came from the children themselves. Marcus organized a letter-writing campaign among his classmates, and the results were heartbreaking in their simplicity and power. "Dear City Council," wrote Sarah, the girl with cerebral palsy who had become one of Marcus's closest friends. "Please don't take away our garden. It's the only place where I can play with all my friends together. The regular playgrounds have steps and bars that I can't use, but the sensory garden has everything I need. Please. Let us keep it the way it is." The letters kept coming, dozens of them, each one a testament to the garden's impact on individual children and families. Emma, the little girl with Down syndrome who had first approached Karen in the sandbox, dictated a letter to her mother explaining how the garden had helped her make friends and feel included. The city council meeting where the proposal was to be discussed was standing room only, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in the lobby. I arrived early with Marcus, Karen, and several other board members, determined to present a united front. The council chambers were divided into 2 distinct camps. On one side sat the Parks and Recreation Department staff, accompanied by city attorneys and insurance representatives. On the other side, the garden's supporters filled every available seat, with many more standing along the walls. Mayor Patricia Rodriguez called the meeting to order and explained the agenda. "We're here to discuss Proposal 2023-47, which would incorporate the Marcus Thompson Memorial Sensory Garden into the city's parks system," she began. "This proposal has generated significant community interest, and we want to hear from all stakeholders before making a decision." The Parks and Recreation Department presented their case first, focusing on issues of liability, standardization, and long-term sustainability. Their presentation was professional and well-prepared, but it felt cold and bureaucratic compared to the passionate advocacy that would follow. "The city has a responsibility to ensure that all recreational facilities meet consistent safety standards," explained Deputy Director James Morrison. "While we appreciate the garden's mission and impact, we cannot allow facilities that don't comply with established protocols to continue operating under city oversight." "But the garden isn't under city oversight," Karen pointed out during the public comment period. "It's a private foundation operating on privately owned land. The city has no legal authority to impose its standards on our facility." "That's correct," Robert Brennan added. "The foundation purchased the land and developed the garden with private funds. The city's role has been limited to providing permits and technical support, not operational control." The debate continued for over 3 hours, with dozens of speakers presenting evidence and arguments on both sides. Medical professionals explained the specialized needs of children with disabilities. Parents shared personal stories of how the garden had transformed their children's lives. Even other municipalities sent representatives to speak about their interest in replicating the garden's model. But the most compelling testimony came from Marcus himself. When his name was called, he wheeled his chair up to the podium with the confidence of someone who had grown up in the public eye. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and this garden is named after me," he began, his voice clear and strong. "When my dad first told me about the garden, I was excited because I thought it would be a place where I could play with other kids, but it became something much more important than that." He paused, looking out at the packed chamber. "The garden isn't just about having fun, though we do have a lot of fun there. It's about showing everyone that kids with disabilities can do amazing things when we have the right support. The adaptive equipment isn't dangerous. It's what makes the garden safe for kids like me." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "If you change the garden to make it like every other playground, you're telling kids with disabilities that we don't deserve spaces designed for us. You're telling us that we should be grateful for whatever we can get, even if it doesn't work for our bodies." The chamber was absolutely silent as Marcus delivered his conclusion. "I know you want to keep kids safe, and so do we. But please don't keep us safe by keeping us out. We belong in this community, and we deserve spaces where we can belong fully." The standing ovation that followed Marcus's speech lasted for several minutes, with many people in the chamber openly crying. Even some of the city staff seemed moved by his words, and I could see the council members exchanging glances that suggested they were reconsidering their position. After all the testimony had been heard, the council retired to executive session to discuss the proposal. The wait was excruciating, made worse by the knowledge that the garden's future hung in the balance. When the council returned, Mayor Rodriguez's expression was unreadable. "After careful consideration of all the testimony and evidence presented tonight," she began, "the City Council has decided to withdraw Proposal 2023-47. The chamber erupted in cheers and applause, but the mayor raised her hand for silence. "However," she continued, "we want to work with the foundation to address the safety concerns that have been raised. We propose establishing a joint committee to develop guidelines for innovative playground equipment that could be adopted by other BIES communities." The compromise was better than we had dared hope. The garden would remain under foundation control, but the city would work with us to develop safety standards that could protect both children and innovative accessibility features. It was a victory not just for our garden, but for the broader movement toward inclusive recreation. As the meeting concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Karen approached me with tears in her eyes. "We did it," she said simply. "We protected what we built." "We did," I agreed. "But this isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter." She smiled, and I realized that she was right. The garden had survived its first major challenge, but that victory had demonstrated something even more important: the power of a community united behind a common vision of inclusion and accessibility. As we walked out of the city hall together, Marcus riding in his wheelchair beside us, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. We had created something beautiful and lasting, something that would serve children with disabilities for generations to come. But more than that, we had created a model for how communities could come together to support their most vulnerable members. The garden continued to thrive and evolve, becoming a destination for families from across the region and a model for inclusive design that was replicated in dozens of other communities. But its greatest success was measured not in visitors or awards, but in the daily miracles of children playing together, learning from each other, and discovering that their differences were not obstacles but opportunities for our connection and growth. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the garden was empty except for the gentle sound of wind chimes and flowing water, I would sit on the memorial bench and think about the journey that had brought us here. A journey that had begun with anger and discrimination, but had led to understanding, healing, and hope. A journey that had taught me that the most powerful response to exclusion is not revenge, but the creation of spaces where everyone belongs. The Marcus Thompson Memorial Sensory Garden had become more than a playground or a memorial. It had become a symbol of what's possible when we choose inclusion over exclusion, when we build bridges instead of walls, and when we see our differences not as problems to be solved, but as gifts to be celebrated.